All right, so as we're continuing on in this series, No Regrets, where we're talking about decisions and living a life where we're not constantly looking back and regretting decisions that we're making, I was thinking this week about the decisions that we make as parents. If you're out there and you have kids, you kind of know what I'm talking about. There are times in life where we have to make decisions for our kids, for our family, and sometimes those decisions turn out well. Other times they don't really turn out the way that we had kind of hoped for. But we have to make all these decisions constantly with our family time and things like that. I know for us right now with 5 kids, we're constantly running with sports and we're busy and it's hectic and it's crazy and we're never all together at one point. And for us, for Rachel and I, we have decided that when we have spare time, we love to be outdoors. We'll go backpacking, we'll go camping, we'll hop in the car and go on a road trip to check out a national park or a state park. And I got to thinking, like, where did that come from? Where was that birthed in me? And I think back to growing up as a kid. We had family. My grandparents lived out in the Clarksville, Tennessee area, and we would spend our summers out here in Tennessee. We'd spend the majority of the time out at the lake house, but every now and then, Papa, my granddad, would load us all up in the camper and the RV, and we'd take off to a state park or a national park somewhere and just spend some time out away from all the craziness of the world. And when we think about those things and just kind of that legacy that he's leaving in me and in my family, it's cool to kind of know that we're going to carry that on with our kids. And just wherever we go, we can think back, we see a picture of a national park somewhere or a state park or something like that, and we constantly come back to these stories. And we tell these stories all throughout life, and it all traces back to my granddad and that legacy that he's kind of left in me and the decisions that he made when my mom, when my aunt, when my uncle were kids, to take time away from work, to take time to schedule time away so that he could be with his family and create those lasting memories and those stories. And so today, as we dive in to part 3 with Jeremy, we're gonna be talking about living a life of not regretting and living a life worth living.
I don't know about you, but I do my very best to just avoid all kinds of pain, discomfort, anything that makes me not like at ease. I don't know about you, but I try to avoid exercising. Well, I don't mean to admit it that way. You might not want to admit it. Maybe you love exercising, but I don't. I would rather sit on the couch than take a walk. But then there comes this day, and maybe you're there, maybe I'm there to some extent for sure, that you start to see what the future is down the road. You start seeing, man, I need to lose a little bit of weight, or maybe I need to get some of my health under control so that it doesn't get out of control. Really, what we're doing is we wind up at that point trading a little bit of discomfort today instead of a lot of discomfort tomorrow. It's the same thing we talked about in this verse that we talked about last week. We called it the Proverbs 27:12. It says, "The prudent or wise people see danger coming and take refuge, but the simple keep going and suffer for it." Smart people see problems that are like a little further down the road and they take shelter from it. But normal people, probably simple people, just keep going and they pay the price. And sometimes we pay dearly for it, don't we? It winds up for us in that parts of our story that we wish we could edit or change, or things we wish we could do over, parts of our story that we wish we could go back and select and delete and forget they ever happened. That's what the price we pay for it. We pay for it in the terms of regret. We have parts of our story that we wish we could do over because we didn't see danger coming and we didn't take refuge. We kept going and suffered for it. But we didn't do that because we wanted to experience the pain. Because when we see danger, we do take refuge. The problem is that we don't see danger coming while it's still down the road. We see it when we're face to face with it. So we've been talking about in this series is trying to ask ourselves a few questions that give us the ability to focus the lenses a little further down the road and see danger while it's still a little bit of a way off. We started last week with the question that we called the integrity question. And the integrity question was really quite simple. It's, am I being honest with myself? Now, it's really easy to think, man, that's what we want to do is kind of have this, I want to be honest with myself feeling. But the truth of it is that we don't have a tendency to really ask that question well, do we? We have a tendency to ask that question and then move on and go, sure. So, what we want you to do is instead of asking that question one time, we want you to start off by asking it 2 times and adding this word. Am I being honest with myself really? Because, man, it's super easy to believe what we already believe, right? In the words of Selena Gomez, the heart wants what it wants, right? Like we already want something and we'll do whatever it takes to get it. But we have to stop and ask ourselves, am I being honest with myself about what's really going on in my heart? Am I really wanting what I want? Why am I really wanting to do that? Why do I want to wear that? Why do I want to do that? Why do I want to move in? Why do I want to move out? Why do I want to get married? Why do I want to file for divorce? We need to ask those questions and then ask ourselves, am I really being honest with myself? And then while we're there, we need to ask some more questions. But before we get there, let's recognize something that we all love story, don't we? Everybody does. Now, you might want it in different formats. Maybe you're a book reader and you like to read maybe historical fiction, or maybe you like to read nonfiction, or you like to read, maybe stories about different situations in life, romance, or different things like that. Or maybe you're like me, you like to see movies. I like story in the form of movies or television. Maybe things that unfold one episode at a time and you binge watch those because it's so easy to get engaged in story. The reason that we all love story in different formats, whether it's books, movies, or TV, or just somebody telling a story or engaging in someone else's story, the reason we love that is because we are living out a story. Our media, whether it's books or movies or TV, takes our cue from our life. Our lives unfold as a story, and that's exactly why media tells story the way it does, because it helps us dream a little differently about the story that we're telling in our lives. But here's the thing that is a tension that's often overlooked in our lives, is that we are writing a story of our lives. Get this. Everything that you're working on and deciding right now, the decisions you're making today and tomorrow, the decisions that you're making in this stage of your life, they are writing the story that you'll tell tomorrow. There will be a day, maybe it's a week from now, or a month from now, or a year from now, when all the decisions and thoughts and ideas that are swimming around in your head right now, and the very decisions that you make, there'll be a day just a little bit down the road when those are no longer decisions. They will instead be reduced, summarized, and recategorized as a story that you'll tell. In fact, this is the way I'd like you to see it today, is that you are writing the story of your life, one decision at a time. And that's really the question that we need to lean into today. The thing that we need to most kind of lean toward or understand today is that you and I, together, we're writing the story of our life, one decision at a time. Today, the decisions you'll make to date someone, to not date someone, the decision you'll make to go out tonight instead of studying for an exam, the decision that you'll make to do this or don't do that, or to talk to that person or don't talk to that person, to buy that or lease that, will now be a decision. But next week, next month, next year, it'll be a story that you tell. The trick is that we have to choose to tell the story in our life, to make decisions that lead us to tell the story that we want to tell, not a story that we hope nobody ever has to hear. That's really what regrets are, aren't they? At one point, your biggest regret, my biggest regrets, were a decision that I made that I hope no one would ever find out about it. They were really just a decision that I made that I hoped would be a story I'd never have to tell. But isn't that the case, that we choose often based on our options rather than on the story that we want to tell? So today, I just want to encourage you to ask yourself, in addition to the integrity question, am I being honest with myself really? Ask yourself another question. We'll call it the legacy question. Which story do you want to tell? That's a big and pressing question. Which story do you want to tell? Do you want to tell the story that I moved in? Or do you want to tell the story that I didn't? Do you want to tell the story that I chose what was wise or intentional or not? Let's just imagine maybe your boss comes up to you tomorrow and your boss says, "Hey, I want you to lie to this client." And you're like, "Well, I don't really feel like I want to lie to the client, but I also don't want to not do what my boss says." So you decide to lie to the client. You lie to the client catches you, and your boss dumps all the responsibility back on you, and you lose your job. What happens? You now have a story where you say, "Well, I got fired from my job because I lied to a client." Now, I'll rewind the story. What if we did it differently? Your boss comes in and he says, "Hey, I want you to lie to this client." And so instead you say, "You know what? I don't really feel like I could lie to the client. I'm not going to do that." And your boss gets mad and fires you. Either way, you lose your job. But what happens is that you now have a story saying, "You know what? I lost my job because I refused to lie to a client." Now, that's a story that I could tell my next employer that gives him confidence to hire me. What about this one? You're up on a Friday night and your friends really want to go out and have a lot of fun, but you've got an exam coming on Monday morning. So instead of going out with your friends and you stay in and you study on your exam and you wind up acing your exam because you stayed in, and you make that same decision over and over again. And instead of a handful of nights out with some stories that you might not be so proud of, you have a degree and a story that you're proud to tell. What if we chose to live out the story that we wanted to tell? Our lives would be radically different. Now, listen, when we look at scripture, sometimes we have a tendency to kind of shift our brains into neutral and try to engage some deeper part of our heart, and that's good. But let's also remember that much of what history is a story. It is history. It's parts of history that play out and tell us things about particular characters. There's this young man that you're probably familiar with because everyone's heard this story at some point or another in their life, the story of Joseph. Now, I say everyone's heard it because even if you've not been around church, it's been turned into a musical, it's been turned into movies, it's been turned into all kinds of different things. And you could probably tell me this story. But let's kind of recap it for us instead of reading it all kind of out of half a dozen chapters. In Genesis chapter 39 is where it kind of begins, but it starts in 1800 BC. About 1800 years before Jesus, there's this young man named Joseph, and he's the 11th of 12 sons. Now that sounds like a lot of kids, and it is. But their most important piece isn't the number of children, it's the number of people who are older than Joseph. He had 10 older brothers. These 10 older brothers were kind of not the greatest storytellers. I mean, they didn't really think ahead about their story because they did not like Joseph. Because Joseph was the favorite son from the favorite one of their dad's wives. Now, that's a mess for us to imagine, but here's what's significant for you and I to understand about it, is that their jealousy of Joseph's issues was such a significant player in their life that it just fueled everything. And somehow these 10 young men, these 10 older brothers got together, and their jealousy so fueled their decision making that they decided they wanted to kill their brother Joseph. And so they took him out into the desert and they were going to kill him. And then they decided that it was not only a bad idea to kill him, but it was more profitable to throw him into a well and sell him off to slave traders. So they threw him down in there and they took his coat and they sold him to slave traders. And they took the blood of an animal and they smeared it all over his coat, and they took it back to Dad and they gave it to Dad, and they said that he had been killed by a wild animal. They lied. Now, because of their story, because of their choices, because of their jealousy, because they made the decision kind of in the moment of time, they now had a secret they had to keep, a lie they had to tell, and because of it, they were liars for life. If you hear nothing else out of today, when you're trying to make any decision, do not ever make a choice that makes you a liar for life. It's a terrible idea, and it's a story you're going to have to tell for the rest of your life when the options are so clear that one of them leaves you a liar for life. Do not make that choice. But Joseph's story goes on. The brothers are liars for life, but Joseph is in the hands of this slave trader, and he's sold again now to another man, a man named Potiphar. who's a fairly rich and powerful man. And he has this choice. And this is how we get to see an example of what is going on in Joseph's life is he has this choice that he has to make. Do I choose to just disengage and do whatever it takes to survive and get by because I'm a slave who is sold into slavery? Or do I own this and serve Potiphar's house like it was my own? Man, isn't that a lot of how our stories play out? I mean, Joseph is in slavery at no consequence of his own actions. Like a lot of our stories, the pain that he's experiencing wasn't any fault of his own. Maybe that's where you're at. Maybe some of the choices that you have, or do I keep living in bitterness, or do I choose a better life? There's an easy part of us to go, man, I didn't make the choices that got me here. That person, that man, that woman, that person in my life kidnapped my story and took it a bad direction. Just like our stories, Joseph was given an option to either live as a victim or be a victim who lived in victory. And he chose the victorious life. He chose a story that he was proud to tell. He said, you know what, even though I was sold into slavery, even though I was bought by Potiphar's house, I am a slave. I'm going to choose to serve Potiphar's house like it's my own house. I'm going to value it. I'm going to invest in it. I'm going to put my heart behind it. And his boss, Potiphar, recognized that, and he kept elevating him in responsibility. And as Joseph engaged more in the story and worked harder and gave more into it, he really obviously had invested well in it, and he became the strongest, the highest person in the house. There was nobody other than Potiphar that was higher than him. But then he was faced with yet another issue. Another one of those, it's not a win-lose situation, it was a lose-lose situation. It wasn't life or death, it was death or death. It was no good because as the head of the household, his wife, Potiphar's wife, approaches Joseph and says that she wants him to become her lover. Now, probably not her only lover, probably one of many in the time, but he was stuck with this decision. And he had to make a choice. Do I have an affair with this woman, or do I honor where I've been and make the right choice? Like, he has these options, and you know how this is. You've been put in a position like this one, maybe not this exact position, but you've been put in a position like this one where you don't know what to say, but you've got to say something. So you kind of think about the options. His first option was story number one. He could go to his boss's wife and say, your husband gave me an opportunity that I never dreamed would come my way. So I was faithful to him and the God who's seen me, who's been watching out for me. Now that's one option, right? That's a good story to tell. Your husband gave me an opportunity I never dreamed that it would come my way. So I took advantage of his trust and I had an affair with his wife. That's the other option. How do you like that idea? When contrasting between those two, which one would you think is the best choice? You had an option that came my way and that I never dreamed would happen, and so I either honored God and I honored my boss, or I took advantage of his trust and I had an affair with his wife. And Joseph does exactly what we're coaching our lives to do right now. He asked himself, which of these two stories do I want to tell? When the decision that I'm making today is reduced and summarized and reclassified as a story that I tell, which of these two stories would I tell? And he chose story number one. In fact, in Scripture, when it tells this story in Genesis 39, Joseph rehearses it. What a powerful tool that we can use. Rehearsing and choosing the better story, and then choosing to rehearse how we're going to go through it and choose to make that not in the moment, not in the middle of all the emotion, but in the time of saying, I'm going to choose it, rehearse it, and then deliver it. So what I'm going to do is I want to summarize a little bit or paraphrase a little bit of Joseph's response and how he tells Potiphar and Potiphar's wife what's going on. And then at the end of it, I'll kind of land right into Scripture and we'll quote it right from the text. But it says this. He basically says that this first part of it, he says, Mrs. Potiphar, I came to this land as a slave. I had no rights and no future. Your husband purchased me, and I did my best to serve him and you. Through my hard work and God's help, I've gained trust of your husband. He has put me in charge of the entire household. And then he says this in the text: with me in charge, he told her, my master does not have any concern with himself or anything in the house. Everything he owns, he has entrusted to my care. No one is greater in this house than I am. My master has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. Do you see the tension of what's rose up in him? He recognizes, because he took a moment to say, which story should I tell? Should I tell story one, that I've been given so much and I decided to honor God and my boss and I'm doing the right thing? Or should I do the wrong thing? Should I use the trust that he's given me? And Joseph makes this decision in the tail end of that verse, and he says, how then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God? Man, that's a powerful question, isn't it? How then could I do such a wicked thing and tell a story that takes me so far off of the story that I want to tell? I don't know where you're at and what decision you're making, because this is such a tough decision for him, because it's not going to end well either way. What happens next isn't that she goes, oh, well, that's a great story. I would love to tell you that's how it ended. But it doesn't end that way. Joseph makes this choice, and Potiphar's wife gets mad about it. She's angry. She's not happy that he chose the better story. She's angry with him, and then she tells everybody that Joseph tried to rape her. And Potiphar, of course, gets furious about that, and he throws him in the dungeon. Now, that's terrible, isn't it? It's exactly what would have happened to him had he had the affair. He could have, like a part of us would say, well, you should have just done that, because you're going to wind up in the dungeon either way. But he doesn't want to make a decision based on the circumstances of today. He wants to make the decision based on the story that he wants to tell tomorrow. The thing that we have to do is choose to train our minds, to pause for just a second and see the things that are ultimate rather than the things that are immediate. See the things that are down the road rather than the things that are right in our face. We need to train our minds to be the kinds of people who see danger coming down the road and take refuge, rather than the kinds of people who suffer, keep going forward and suffer for it. What happens next is profound. He spends years in the dungeon. He's thrown into the dungeon and he spends years there, smelling like the people, smelling like the outcast that he is. Years in the dungeon, and all that time passes by and there's no hope. But what Joseph has is a story that he's proud to tell. And then comes a day when the Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, basically comes down because he's had a dream, and none of his magicians, none of his advisors can tell him what it means, and he doesn't understand it, but he hears of this man Joseph who has some integrity. And he's in the dungeon, but he hears about him and his reputation of being able to figure out what dreams mean, and he calls him up. Now, this is a risky day for Joseph, another risky day. He's in the presence of the Pharaoh. You got to watch your P's and Q's in the presence of the Pharaoh. And so he walks in to see the Pharaoh, and he spends time in there, and the Pharaoh tells him about his dream, and Joseph leans into what God has to say and tells Pharaoh about what the dream means. He tells him that there's a period of great harvest coming, 7 years where there'll be tons of grain. Now, you got to get this about grain. Grain isn't just like it is for us, one part of our diet. It was the substantial piece of their diet. From grain, they make bread, and from bread, they have the staple of their diet. No low carb people in Egypt, I guess. But like, they make this bread and it's a big deal. And what Joseph says to him is, over the next 7 years, you're going to have a great abundance of grain. But here's the problem. 7 years from now, we're going to begin a terrible famine where there won't be any grain. So he tells him what his dream is about. And that would be easy for Joseph to just kind of go, that's it, see you later, and let you figure out what to do. But what Joseph does next allows him to see the story that he wants to tell. He offers the unthinkable to Pharaoh. Standing in front of him, smelling like the dungeon, he offers Pharaoh unsolicited advice. That's hard to imagine, isn't it? to offer Pharaoh unsolicited advice? Because nobody would allow them to do that. Nobody would let just some slave from the dungeon offer unsolicited advice to the king. But he does. He says, what you need to do, Pharaoh, is appoint one person who gets up every single day and makes sure for the next 7 years that Egypt is ready for the 7 years that are to follow. You need to have one person over the next 7 years who gets up every single day and makes sure that you store enough grain away so that 7 years from now, you're able to survive the famine that's coming. You can imagine the hush that fell over the room. The hush that was all over the place as this smelly dungeon slave tells the Pharaoh what he thinks he should do with the kingdom. You can imagine the fear that was in Joseph's knees until this happened. The Pharaoh responded to Joseph and he said this to him. He said, the Pharaoh said, Joseph, since God has made all this known to you, there is no one so discerning and as wise as you. You shall be in charge of all of my palace, and I will make all my people who are to submit to you, to your orders. Only with respect to the throne will I be greater than you. Wow. That's a story, isn't it? All of a sudden, he's elevated to this place of unbelievable power. From the stench of the dungeon to the throne room of the king. That's a powerful transition, all because he keeps choosing to tell a story with his decisions that he wants to see later in his life told in public. And so often, isn't it the case that you and I wind up trying to make decisions based on what we feel or think is the best option today? Wouldn't it be better if we could, like Joseph, see further down the road and decide I want to tell the kind of story with my decisions that I want to tell to my children and my grandchildren? Wouldn't it be great for us if we could ask ourselves that legacy question? What decision can I make today that will make a great story to tell tomorrow? Not a story I'm ashamed to tell, not a story that I hope nobody finds out. What happens next in Joseph's story is pretty profound, because his brothers who sold him into slavery and thought he was dead by now, he's now 30 years old and the famine has gone on. Over those 7 years, Joseph has worked to stock away grain, and Egypt is by far known as the richest people in the world. And when the famine hits, his brothers are starving. They have no potential, they have no money, they have no way to get grain or buy grain. And so they come to Egypt looking for help. And they show up in Egypt, and Joseph's out for the day, but he immediately recognizes his brothers. His brothers don't recognize him because they weren't expecting to see him. They weren't expecting him to be alive. They had a story that they hoped no one would find out until that moment. And you can imagine the terror in their hearts when all of a sudden they came face to face with this man who's in charge of the kingdom of Egypt, but is also their brother that they sold into slavery. Can you imagine what it felt like when their story became discovered, when the decisions that they made 12 or 13 years ago now became obvious? You can probably imagine it because we've all been there. We've all had the story that we wish we could keep a secret become discovered and come to light. It's not fun. It's terrible. But we choose it. But it's amazing is that Joseph doesn't choose to tell a story of bitterness. I mean, it would be justified to tell a story of bitterness, wouldn't it? It would be justified to kick his brothers to the curb. It would be justified to say, you don't get anything. In fact, I'm gonna go back and tell my dad what you did to me. But he doesn't. He says, go back and get dad and the family and bring them all here. And he takes great care of them. You know, it's really hard for us to figure out or imagine sometimes is how we do this. How do we get to a place in our lives where we tell a story with our decisions that we'll be proud to tell to our kids or our grandkids? How do we get to that place? Because we get in this tension, don't we? We get in the tension where we're in the moment making a decision rather than choosing to give ourselves some pause. And what Joseph did time and time and time again in his life, and what I hope that you and I will do as a result of this morning, is choose to pause when emotions are high. Every single time Joseph faced an issue, right? Whether it was being sold into slavery, you can imagine his emotions were high. You can imagine when he sold to Potiphar's house, and he goes from being a rich kid to a poor slave. His emotions were high. When Potiphar's wife offers this affair to him and chooses to put him in this terrible situation, his emotions were high. When he was given the opportunity to give advice to the king, his emotions were high. When his brothers showed up on the story, his emotions were high. But here's what he did every time. When emotions were high, it put up a yellow light, not a green light. Man, so easy for us to get wrapped up in the emotions of our moment, isn't it? And the moment's emotions tend to rule everything. And what do? Every single time? The emotions of the decision complicate factors infinitely, don't they? It makes it easy to go, I just want to lash out in anger, or I want to buy that because I want it. They made me desire it. But what we need to do when our emotions are running high is press pause, not play. Give ourselves a little caution, a yellow light, not a green light. Don't press stop. We can't stop making decisions. We have to choose to make a decision. But what we can do is pause for just a moment and say, wait a second. Am I being honest with myself really? And asking ourselves, what story do I want to tell a week, a month, a year, or 2 years from now? That's really the question we have to deal with. If we want to live a life with no regrets, a life that doesn't have any kind of power over us, but yet a life that we want to choose to move forward, we have to make a decision right now. I will decide a story I will be proud to tell. Whatever decision you're making right now. Whether your decision that you're trying to make right now is one of who I'm going to date, who I'm going to marry, who I'm going to move in with or out from, who I'm going to hang out with, what decisions I'm going to make on a given Friday night. What question you need to ask is, what story do I want to tell a week, a month, or a year from now? Because there will be a day when the decision that you're making today will be reduced, reclassified, and told as a story. Will it be a story that you're proud to tell? Or will it be a story that you're ashamed to tell? Will it be a story that you can't wait to tell, or one that you can't figure out a way to hide? Please don't make choices that leave you a liar for life. Let's pray together. God, we're just thankful that you give us wisdom, that your Holy Spirit provides wisdom to us and gives us the ability to pause and push pause on our decision making and choose to lean in and ask you for leading. Which story do we want to tell? God, we're thankful for Joseph's story and what it does to give us clarity in our lives and help us to make choices that are wise. Help us to make choices that let us tell a story that we're proud of. And we ask that in your name. Amen.